In this segment of friction in the labor markets, we'll briefly take a look at a couple of other friction forms that we might think about. One is in different markets, worker might receive different pay, and another is this concept of mobility that we briefly referenced in an earlier segment in this module. So let's think about the concept of different markets and different pay. We might see in a given market, let's say market A, if you will, we might see a labor market model that might look a little bit like this, where we have a labor supply and a labor demand. Labor supply. And a labor demand with some labor and wage. And we'll create a W star, which we think of as the W star for market A. And yet, in a different market, perhaps there is a different supply and demand relationship. Perhaps in that different market, firms have a different demand requirement, and there's a different number of workers, such that perhaps the labor supply curve is maybe much flatter. Maybe it even started at a smaller or different reservation wage, and maybe we also have a very flat labor demand curve, such that we have a different W star and L star for market B. So the red W star for market B and the blue W star for market A may well be very different as they appear to be within these two models. And this may simply be a function of the supply and the demand of workers, or surplus or shortage of workers in a given marketplace. Perhaps we have some kind of a different market, different pay structure as a function of cost of living differences. Well, let's think about the surplus, and then we'll look at cost of living, and then we'll look at the other two items as well. So surplus or shortage of workers. Let's assume that we have this market in which we have some wage floor that was established above W star, labor supply, labor demand, L, W, W star, and L star. So in this market, we have this higher level of W floor. Let's say that it was at that 8.25. Maybe we have our 7.5 and our 8.25 relationship here. That yielded some mismatch between labor supply and labor demand, such that we have a labor demand that is less than labor supply, so we have a surplus of workers. And we're then subject to paying this 8.25. We'd like to pay them a lower dollar amount based upon supply and demand, but we're subject to this 8.25. But perhaps in yet a different market of the same type of worker, we have a different relationship. Maybe there just aren't as many workers in this other marketplace, such that our labor supply and labor demand already equilibrates at a level that is different, and maybe that level is even at, let's say, 950. So it equilibrates at a higher level of W star, in which case this wage floor set in this market would be irrelevant, and there isn't a surplus or a shortage that arises in this particular market, and so we have an L star, but the demand and the supply characteristics of this market simply yielded a higher W star than it did in the initial market. The wage floor in this initial market yielded us some kind of a shortage, in which case we would have perhaps some unemployment. It yielded a supply that's greater than demand. I said that was surplus a moment ago. Please excuse me. I should have said unemployment, which is the same thing as surplus, really. So if this is the case, and then we have in a different market, we have a different supply and demand for the same kind of worker where the wage is higher, you might suppose that some of those unemployed might try to find a way to migrate to this other market which might then motivate some kind of a change in the labor supply curve, would shift the labor supply curve outward, and perhaps we would end up back at or near this 8 1/4 wage, if that were the case. So what we see here is a couple of things take place. We see in an initial market, let's call it market A, we see that an equilibrium wage of $7.50 was trumped by a wage floor of 8 1/4. That caused then labor demand at that wage to be less than labor supply at that wage, which means we have some surplus of workers and yielding some unemployment. And if there is easy mobility from one market to another, which there probably was not, but if there was, then we see that that might motivate some movement outward of the labor supply curve as some of these unemployed workers go to find work in this other market, which then might bring this back down to the 8 1/4 level, or maybe even the 7.50 level, in which case the wage floor would become important for both markets. But the reason that I say that we might see this kind of migration, but probably would not, is if that were the case, we wouldn't have had the imbalance to begin with. The supply and demand relationships for these two markets would have already balanced one another. So apparently there's something about the cost of mobility in this case that might make it such that these workers can't justify moving to this new market to receive even a job at 8 1/4 or 9.50 an hour. So this is a surplus or shortage issue. We might see different markets and different pays as a function of cost of living differences. Think back to the prior segment where we talked very briefly about compensating wage differentials. And so we see that a cost of living difference exists, so there must be a different wage that exists. If we have the same type of worker with the same skill set expecting a similar compensation, but we have a higher cost of living in one marketplace than we do another, then there must be a wage that will reflect that. Otherwise, we have really a pretty good mismatch in the real compensation of workers. Or maybe there's a desirability of a location. Perhaps I would love to live in a resort town, maybe on Maui, and I have a high skill set. With that high skill set in San Francisco, maybe I can make $125,000 a year, but with that skill set on Maui, maybe I can only make $75,000 a year. And if I were to make that move to Maui, it would tell us then that I value the desirability of the Maui location more than I value the $50,000. So I might be choosing to receive this lower wage in a different market as kind of a compensating wage differential for the value of the desirability of that location. We can say the same kind of thing then with respect to working conditions in firms, either to the positive or to the negative. I might, once again, as we talked about in the earlier segment, if I go to work for a firm that I know has terrible working conditions, I would expect a greater wage for that, rather than staying in the market where I was, where the working conditions in the firm were average or normal, if you will. When we think about this issue of employees going from market to market and maybe accepting differences, we're also thinking about the concepts of mobility. So one of the things we need to consider in the concepts of mobility is what we might be seeing with respect to changes in the labor supply curve. Not necessarily shifts in or shifts out, but maybe adjustments in the slope of the curve. So we'll think about this with respect to job search costs. We'll think about this with respect to loss of income between jobs as we're being mobile, and we'll think about the cost of actual transportation or relocation from the first job market to another job market. So mobility might be going from one job market in a state to another job market. Maybe I'm going from San Francisco to Los Angeles or vice versa, or maybe I'm going from Salt Lake City to Park City. So maybe it's the cost of going from one location in a state to another, or it might be the cost of going from one state to another. So that's just mobility within our state or then within our nation. But it may just as easily be mobility within the world, as we think about that more generally as immigration. Maybe I'm going from the United States to France or Mexico to the United States. So I have to think about the search costs, the time between jobs and loss of income. I have to think about transportation and relocation expenses expenses. And so how might I consider these in terms of changes in the slope of the labor supply curve? So let's look at this. Let's assume for a moment that I have what I'll call a normally sloped labor market model. I don't know what the word normal means in this case. It's just the one I chose to use. And I'm not going to worry here all that much about W star and L star. I just know that they exist, and I know that the slope of these two curves informs them. So if that's the case, and if I have to think about changes in slope with respect to labor supply because of, let's say, a job search cost, that would then suggest that I need a higher income. And so if I need a higher income, then maybe I would even think about a shift upward in the labor supply curve. I think that's possible that we would consider that. Or possibly I simply need a steeper labor supply curve. So one that is far steeper, suggesting that as I think about the trading of labor units for wage, it's a different trade-off than my earlier discussion of labor units for wage. You can see here that for roughly the same trade-off in labor units, in the more flat curve, the flatter curve, I saw less of a increase in wage. Where here in the steeper curve, same trade-off in units approximately, I see a much greater trade-off in the required wage that I would receive. So if there is a high job search cost, then maybe in this market, inclusive of this mobility, the labor supply curve becomes much higher. Or if there's a significant loss of income between jobs, maybe my supply curve becomes much higher. Or maybe if the cost of transportation relocation is high, then my labor supply curve becomes much steeper. Now we might have just the opposite. We might see that in these job searches that the firm is actually paying some kind of a bonus, a signing bonus, in which case maybe that would give us an opportunity to see a flattening of this rather than a steepening of it. So maybe we'll make this yet flatter still. Maybe it's much flatter. If we know that those job search costs plus some will be bonused to the employee if they make this move. So we can see that the greater the costs of mobility, the steeper the labor supply curve. If the costs of mobility are low or are less than they might have been at just staying place, then we can see that it might flatten the labor supply curve.